In October of 1888, Clara Pendelton walked into the Shenandoah woods and came back mute. She never spoke another word to her parents, the doctor, or anyone who tried to reach her. Instead, her hands began to move, tracing lines and passages across every surface she could find. What she drew were tunnels, underground passages that didn't exist on any official chart of Virginia. And just when the valley believed it understood what she had seen, she walked back into the trees and didn't return. In the autumn of 1888, the Shenandoah Valley sat between two mountain ranges like a world apart from the rest of Virginia. The Blue Ridge rose to the east and the Alleghanies stood to the west, and between them the land rolled in folds of forest and field that few outsiders ever bothered to cross. The people who lived there had learned to depend on themselves. They grew their own food, milled their own grain, and buried their own dead without calling for help from Richmond or any other city. The Pendelton family lived on a homestead somewhere in the lower reaches of that valley, near the wooded slopes where cleared farmland gave way to thick timber and rocky outcroppings. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't destitute either. They had cattle, a vegetable garden, a wooden house with a stone chimney, and enough standing in the community that their name meant something when it was spoken at church or in the general store. Clara was their daughter. She was young, though exact accounts differ on whether she had seen 19 winters or 21. What everyone agreed on was this: she was quiet by nature, reliable with chores, and possessed of a sharp eye for detail that her mother noticed whenever Clara helped with the sewing or the preserving. In the 1,880 seconds, a young woman in rural Virginia occupied a very specific place. Her world was defined by the boundaries of her family's property, the route to the nearest creek, the path to church on Sundays, and the few neighbors close enough to visit without losing half a day to walking. Most of the men in Clara's life worked the land or timber. Most of the women managed households that operated like small factories, churning butter, salting meat, rendering lard, and keeping the fires burning through winters that came early to the valley. It was a hard life, but it was a known life. The routines were old, and the people who followed them were comforted by that age. October of 1888 arrived with the particular melancholy that Appalachian autumns carry. The mornings grew sharp. The leaves turned quickly that year, burning orange and red against the dark evergreen slopes, and by mid-month the ground was carpeted so thickly that footsteps made no sound. It was on one of these October mornings that Clara Pendelton left her family's house to gather something from the woods. Maybe it was berries, maybe it was firewood, maybe she was simply walking a path she had walked 100 times before, following a route that every member of her family knew by heart. What is certain is this: she walked past the edge of the cleared land and into the trees, and she didn't come back when she was expected. The Pendelton family waited through the afternoon, calling her name across the fields and checking the places where she usually went. By the time the sun dropped behind the western ridges and the valley filled with the blue-gray half-light of an Appalachian evening, the worry had turned into something heavier, something that everyone in that valley understood without needing to say it out loud. The woods had taken people before, and sometimes they didn't give them back. The next morning, the Pendeltons went looking. They were joined by neighbors, cousins, and men from adjoining farms who set aside their own work because that was what the valley did when someone went missing. The searchers fanned out from the homestead in widening circles, calling Clara's name through the timber, probing the undergrowth with long sticks, and checking every hollow log and creek bed where a person might have fallen or taken shelter. They found nothing. No footprints they could follow with confidence, no scrap of clothing caught on a branch, and no sign that Clara Pendelton had passed that way at all. The terrain beyond the Pendelton farm wasn't forgiving. Forest floors dropped into ravines that collected water and dead leaves in equal measure. Canopies grew thick enough in places that a person could lose sight of the sky entirely, and sound didn't carry the way it did across open fields. A person calling from 20 yards away could sound like they were shouting from another country. The searchers knew this. Many of them had grown up in the shadow of these same ridges, and they understood that the Shenandoah woods had a way of swallowing sound, distance, and sometimes people themselves. On the second day, the search expanded. Men rode to nearby settlements to ask if anyone had seen a young woman walking the roads or sitting by a stream. The answer was always no. Clara hadn't emerged from the trees. She hadn't knocked on any door asking for directions or water or help. The ground might as well have opened beneath her feet and taken her straight down. That was how the older searchers talked about it among themselves, not because they believed in literal holes in the earth, but because they had all heard stories about the woods. Stories that weren't told to children, but were remembered by adults who had spent enough nights in the hollows to know that some disappearances didn't resolve themselves into happy endings. The second night was colder than the first. The searchers built fires at the edge of the forest and sat with their backs to the flames, staring into the darkness between the trees. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking. In a community like this, hope was a resource that had to be managed carefully. Too much of it, and you set yourself up for a grief that would hollow you out. Too little, and you gave up on someone who might still be alive, huddled in a rock formation, or wandering in a fever, waiting for a voice she recognized. So they sat in silence, feeding the fires, listening to the woods breathe around them, and they waited for morning. The third day brought no new discoveries. The dogs that had been brought in circled and sniffed and whined, but they couldn't pick up a trail that led anywhere definite. The leaves were too thick, the ground too damp, the air too full of the scent of decaying vegetation, for any hound to isolate a single human path. By the afternoon of that third day, some of the searchers began to drift back to their own farms. They didn't say they were giving up. They said they needed to check on their livestock, or their own families, or the work that was piling up in their absence. But the truth was simpler. 3 days in those woods was enough to teach anyone that some searches don't end the way you want them to, and some don't end at all. It was late on the fourth afternoon when one of the younger cousins, a boy named Ezekiel, who had been walking the ridgeline looking for signs, stopped and stared into the trees below him. He thought he saw movement, then a figure, pale and slow, walking between the trunks with no particular hurry, as if the forest were a garden, and the person were simply strolling through it on a Sunday afternoon. He called out, but the figure didn't answer. It turned, and Ezekiel ran down the slope with a shout that brought the remaining searchers running. What they found was Clara, but it wasn't the Clara they had lost. She stood at the base of a steep hollow, where the trees grew so close together that daylight barely reached the ground. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with mud and leaf matter, in patterns that suggested she had lain down more than once. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung around her face in wet strands. Though it hadn't rained in 2 days, her feet were bare, the soles cut and bruised in ways that made the older women turn away. But the worst part was her eyes. They were open, and they were focused, but they didn't seem to see any of the people standing in front of her. They looked past them, or through them, at something beyond reach. She didn't speak. Not when her mother ran to her and took her by the shoulders. Not when her father said her name, in a voice that cracked with relief and fear at the same time. Not when the neighbors gathered around and asked where she had been, what she had eaten, whether she was hurt, whether she knew who they were. Clara stood in the center of that circle of familiar faces and made no sound at all. It wasn't the silence of someone choosing not to answer. It was the silence of someone who had forgotten how to make words, or who had learned that words were no longer sufficient for what she needed to say. They carried her back to the homestead. Her mother stripped away the ruined dress and washed the dirt from her skin with water warmed on the stove. Clara didn't flinch or shiver. She sat on a wooden stool by the fire and let her mother work, her eyes fixed on the flames, studying them the way a person studies a language. They have forgotten how to speak. They fed her broth, and she swallowed it. They offered her bread, and she chewed it. But when they spoke to her, she gave nothing back. There was no nod, no smile, no gesture of recognition. It was as if the person they had known had stepped out of her body and left the shell behind, a shell that breathed and ate and stared but no longer belonged to the world of conversation. A doctor rode out from the nearest town 2 days later, a tired man in his 50s who had seen fevers, broken bones, childbirth, and death in equal measure across the scattered farms of the valley. Clara's feet, throat, and eyes were examined with the same methodical attention he would have given a fever patient. His stethoscope, which had seen better years, pressed against her chest while he listened for any sound that shouldn't be there. Questions came in a loud, deliberate voice, as if volume might restore what softness couldn't. Clara didn't respond. The doctor sat back on his heels and told the Pendletons what they already knew. No physical injury explained what had happened to their daughter. No blow to the head, no infection of the throat, no fever had burned away her speech. In the medical language of 1888, the diagnosis was nervous shock, a condition of the mind brought on by some experience too terrible for the body to process. Rest, warmth, and time were his recommendations. What went unspoken was what everyone in the room was thinking. That time had already passed, and Clara wasn't coming back from wherever she had gone. The valley had its own explanations, of course. In a community where the church and the doctor were the two institutions that attempted to impose order on a wild landscape, there was always room for interpretations that fell outside both. Some of the older neighbors whispered that Clara had encountered something in the woods that wasn't meant to be seen by the living. They didn't name it. They didn't describe it. They only said that the Shenandoah Hills had always been home to things that preferred the dark, and that sometimes those things reached out and took something from a person as payment for being witnessed. Others suggested a simpler explanation, that she had fallen, hit her head, and wandered in a fever for 4 days, and that the silence was a mercy her mind had wrapped around itself to keep the memory at bay. Both explanations carried weight. Neither explained what happened next, because after she had been home for a week, after the cuts on her feet had begun to heal, and her mother had coaxed her into wearing shoes again, Clara's hands began to move. At first, it was subtle. A finger tracing a line on the table while she stared at nothing, a hand sweeping through the air, brushing at something invisible that only she could sense. Her mother noticed it first, then her sisters, then the neighbors, who came to sit with her in the afternoons, because the Pendleton house had become a place people felt drawn to without understanding why. The movements weren't random. They were deliberate, rhythmic, almost purposeful, and when someone finally placed a stick of charcoal and a sheet of paper in front of her, Clara picked them up without hesitation and began to draw. The first marks were rough, scratched lines crossed and doubled back, circles that didn't close, shapes that resembled nothing. The Pendletons recognized. Her mother set the paper aside and brought another. Clara filled that one too, and another after that, and soon the kitchen table was covered with sheets that looked at first like the meaningless scribbles of a disturbed mind. But by the 5th day of drawing, the scribbles began to change. Lines grew straighter, angles became more precise. Curves began to suggest a logic that was architectural rather than accidental, as if Clara were working her way toward a form she had always known but could only now release through her fingers. By the 2nd week, the drawings had become something else entirely. They were maps, though not maps in the way a surveyor would understand them. They showed the land from above, but they also showed what lay beneath it. Long passages ran in parallel lines, intersecting at junctions, marked with small symbols that might have been rooms or chambers or spaces without names. Elevation was indicated with careful hatch marks, as if Clara had measured the depths with instruments she didn't possess. The scale was consistent across every sheet. 1 inch on her drawings corresponded to roughly 60 yards on the ground, a ratio that no one in the household had taught her and that she had never needed to know in her ordinary life. Papers were spread across the kitchen table, then the floor, then the walls, pinned with tacks where the light from the windows fell brightest. Neighbors came to see. The local preacher came. Even the doctor returned, though this time without his stethoscope. He only stood in the doorway and looked at the walls with an expression that suggested he had traveled beyond the reach of his own understanding. Everyone who saw the maps recognized something. The ridge line to the east of the Pendleton farm appeared on the 3rd sheet, drawn with an accuracy that made the neighbor who had hunted those slopes for 20 years nod in recognition. On the 7th sheet, the creek behind the Miller property showed up, bending at the exact angle where the old willow tree leaned over the water. But these surface features were only the beginning, because Clara had drawn what lay beneath them, and what lay beneath didn't match anything anyone had ever heard of. The tunnels ran for miles. They connected landmarks that were separated by ridges and ravines that no sane engineer would attempt to tunnel through. They descended to depths of 200 feet, 300 feet, in places where the bedrock was known to be solid granite. They contained chambers large enough to hold a church congregation, and passages narrow enough that a person would have to crawl. Some tunnels ended in dead walls. Others branched into networks so complex that following them required laying multiple sheets side by side and tracking the connections with a finger. And nowhere in any land record or survey document or memory of the oldest residents was there any mention of these passages existing. A surveyor from the county office was summoned, a practical man who measured property lines and settled boundary disputes between farmers who disagreed about where their fences should stand. Clara's drawings were examined with a magnifying glass and compared to every official map in his possession. He rode out to the locations she had marked and measured the terrain with his transit and his chain. The return was made with a shake of his head. Surface features were correct. Ridgelines, creeks, rock formations, old logging roads, all matched the official surveys with an accuracy that surprised him. But the tunnels beneath them were fictions. No limestone existed in that area to create natural caverns of that size. No mining operation had ever been licensed in that part of the county. No railroad had proposed a route through those hills. The tunnels Clara Pendelton had drawn simply didn't exist, according to every tool and record that the county of Shenandoah possessed. But Clara kept drawing, and the drawings were about to become something that no surveyor could measure with instruments. Her mother would find her at the kitchen table before dawn, the charcoal moving across the paper with a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. The drawings grew more detailed, more elaborate, more disturbing. Depth markers began to appear that went far below anything a natural cave system could achieve. Staircases descended into darkness, and vertical shafts dropped like wells into passages below. Clara never stopped. Meals passed without her looking up. Conversations flowed around her like water around a stone. Her fingers turned black and her eyes turned red with exhaustion, and then she would sleep for a few hours and wake to draw again. Wad traveled the way it always traveled in the Shenandoah Valley, carried by farm wagons and church gossip and the taciturn exchanges that passed for conversation at the general store. By the third week of Clara's drawing, people were coming from settlements that were a full day's ride away. They came with their own theories, their own expertise, their own need to see something that didn't fit into the world they thought they understood. A surveyor from Richmond arrived with leather cases full of instruments and a reputation for precision that he guarded like a family heirloom. A professor of geology from a small college in the western part of the state came with notebooks and a camera that used plates of glass to capture images. A newspaperman came with pencils and a pad, though he admitted privately that he had no idea how to write about something that defied the conventions of his craft. And a spiritualist came, a thin woman in black, who claimed to have visited other communities where the boundary between the living and the dead had grown thin enough to see through. Each visitor brought a different lens, and each lens produced a different image of what Clara Pendelton had become. The Richmond surveyor measured her drawings with his instruments and confirmed what the local man had already said. The surface details were accurate to within fractions of an inch. The underground details corresponded to nothing in the historical record. He suggested, with the careful neutrality of a professional man who didn't wish to sound foolish, that Clara might have encountered some natural geological formation during her 4 days in the woods, perhaps a shallow cave or a sinkhole, and that her mind had expanded this encounter into a vast imaginary architecture. It wasn't an explanation that satisfied anyone, least of all the surveyor himself, but it was the only one that his training allowed him to offer. The professor was more intrigued than skeptical. Years of studying the rock formations of the Appalachian region had taught him that limestone could dissolve into caverns, given enough time and water. Soil around the Pendleton farm was examined, water from their well tested for mineral content, and subtle surface signs that sometimes indicated underground cavities were searched for. Nothing turned up, and the bedrock was wrong, and the drainage patterns were wrong. The depth and complexity of the passages Clara had drawn exceeded anything that natural processes could have created in that particular stretch of Virginia geology. His notebooks left full, his curiosity unsatisfied, muttering about the limits of scientific knowledge in the face of phenomena that refused to fit its categories. But the worst of it hadn't been seen yet, because the maps were only beginning to show what they were truly for. The newspaperman wrote a story that appeared in a regional paper under a headline so sensational that the Pendletons refused to let him return. It described Clara as a mystic, a prophet, a young woman who had been touched by forces beyond human understanding. The spiritualist read the article and came immediately, believing that she had found a kindred spirit. 3 hours one afternoon were spent sitting with Clara, holding her hands and speaking in a low voice about the other side, the veil, the spirits who walked in places where the living didn't belong. Clara didn't respond. No look was given to the spiritualist. Only the drawing continued, charcoal scratching out another tunnel, another chamber, another passage that led somewhere no living person had ever claimed to go. The spiritualist left in tears, though whether they were tears of frustration or recognition, no one could say. What she told the Pendletons was this: Clara wasn't drawing the underworld. The between world was what appeared on the paper, the space that existed beneath the soil and above the depths where the dead rested. A place for wanderers, she said. A place for people who had gone too far into the woods and had been claimed by something that didn't want to let them go completely, something that had taken Clara's voice as a keepsake and left her hands moving, as a reminder that the bargain wasn't yet finished. It was an old timberman named Silas Crane who first recognized something he knew. Silas had spent 40 years in the Shenandoah woods, cutting timber for mills and hauling logs down slopes that horses could barely navigate. He had slept under rock overhangs that most people never knew existed, and he had walked ridges in weather so thick with fog that he navigated by memory rather than sight. When he looked at the 7th map, his fingers stopped moving. He tapped the paper twice and said nothing for a long moment. Then he shared with the Pendletons that he knew the place Clara had drawn on the surface. He had sat beneath that same stone outcropping in the summer of 1864, waiting out a thunderstorm that had turned the sky green and made the hair on his arms stand straight up. A small group assembled the following morning. Silas led them, carrying a copy of the map that Clara's father had traced by hand in a lamplight the night before. 2 younger men came with ropes and lanterns and a compass that one of them had inherited from his grandfather. They walked for 3 hours, following deer trails and crossing streams on fallen logs until they reached the ridge that Silas had described. And when they found it, they stopped, because the stone outcropping was exactly where Clara had placed it. The angle of the slope matched her drawing to within a degree. The fallen chestnut tree she had marked beside it was still there, though it had been rotting for 20 years and was now little more than a moss-covered hump on the forest floor. Everything on the surface was correct, but when they looked for the entrance that Clara's map indicated, a vertical shaft descending into the earth at the base of the outcropping, they found only solid ground. Sticks probed the ground. Shovels dug where the map indicated. Ears pressed against stone, listening for hollow sounds, while hammers tapped out a rhythm of inquiry. The echoes came back dull and solid, the sound of rock against rock with nothing in between. The search expanded in a circle around the outcropping, looking for any depression in the ground, any crack in the stone, any opening that a person might have missed in a casual pass. Nothing presented itself. The earth was intact, and the bedrock was continuous. If there had ever been a door into the underground at that place, it had been sealed so thoroughly that no trace remained on the surface. The ride back to the Pendleton farm was quieter than the ride out. Each man was thinking the same thing, though none of them said it aloud. Clara had drawn a world that was precise in every visible detail and absent in the one place that mattered most. She had mapped a door that didn't exist, or that existed only for her, or that had existed once and had been closed so completely that the ground itself had forgotten where it had been. Silas Crane was the last to leave the Pendleton house that evening. From the doorway he looked back at Clara, who was drawing at the kitchen table by the light of a single lamp. What he told her father was this: 40 years in those woods had never shown him anything that matched what the girl was putting on paper, but there was more. Silas admitted that he had felt things in the hollows. His eyes couldn't confirm, sounds without sources, spaces that seemed larger inside than the outside could justify. The word haunted never crossed his lips. Instead, he said the mountains had always been older than the people who tried to read them, and that some pages refused to turn. Clara didn't look up from her drawing when Silas spoke, but those who were watching her claimed afterward that her hand hesitated for just a moment, a fraction of a second, when the charcoal paused in its arc and hung in the air before descending again to complete the line. Perhaps it meant nothing, perhaps it was only the draft from the open door. In the weeks that followed, though the men who had been on that expedition found themselves looking at the ground differently. Earth settled in certain places, drawing their attention in patterns they couldn't explain. Hollow sounds surfaced where there should have been none. The ridge beneath the stone outcropping was avoided even when work or hunting brought them close. No one discussed it aloud. Paths simply altered themselves as if the land had asked them to walk elsewhere. And while the men were adjusting their routes and looking at the ground with new suspicion, Clara was adding something to her maps that would make the failed expedition feel like a prelude to something far worse. In the weeks after the failed expedition, Clara's drawings underwent a change that frightened the Pendletons more than anything they had seen before. The architectural precision remained, but it was no longer the dominant feature. The tunnels began to contain figures, small human shapes, no larger than a fingernail, walking through the passages she had drawn. At first the figures were anonymous, stick-like representations that could have been anyone. But as the days passed, they acquired details. Shoulders appeared, then the suggestion of clothing, then postures that implied movement or waiting or hesitation. Some of the figures carried lanterns that cast no light on the walls around them. Others walked with their hands extended, as if feeling their way through darkness that the drawing couldn't depict, but that Clara somehow understood. The faces came last, and they were the worst. On the 19th map, a figure in a side chamber turned toward the viewer with features that Mrs. Pendleton recognized before she could stop herself from looking. It was her own mother's face, rendered with an accuracy that made her drop the paper and step back from the table. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. She had never spoken to Clara about the details of her appearance, and there were no portraits in the house that could have served as a reference. Yet there she was, young again, standing in a tunnel that didn't exist, looking out from the paper with an expression that Mrs. Pendleton could only describe as patient, as if she were waiting for something that she knew would arrive, but that she didn't need to hurry. Other faces followed: a neighbor's son who had drowned in the creek 3 summers before, a preacher who had died of fever in 1879, and, on one map that Clara's father found pinned to her bedroom wall in the middle of the night, a face that no one in the household recognized. A young man with dark hair and eyes that seemed to follow the viewer no matter where they stood in the room. He stood at a junction where 5 tunnels met, and his hand was raised as if in greeting or warning. No one in the valley admitted to knowing him. No one in the family had ever seen him before. But Clara drew him with a tenderness that disturbed her mother more than any of the other figures. The lines flowed as if she knew him well, as if her 4 days in the woods had been spent walking beside him, through passages that only she could see. The maps also began to suggest time in ways that no cartographer would attempt. Some passages were drawn with clean, sharp lines that suggested new construction, walls that hadn't yet been touched by moisture or age. Others were rendered with broken, crumbling edges, collapsed ceilings, and debris that blocked the path. What Clara seemed to be showing was not only what was, but what had been, and perhaps what would be. Laid out in the order she created them, the sequence of maps told a story of a system that was alive in some sense, changing, growing in places and dying in others, a network that had its own metabolism and its own memory. And Clara was its only historian. Her mother tried to stop her from drawing. The charcoal was taken away and the paper hidden. Clara found other materials. Lines were scratched into the wooden table with a kitchen knife. Ashes from the fireplace became a canvas. Mud from the yard and her own fingers served when nothing else was available. The compulsion had passed beyond choice. It was now a function, as automatic as breathing, and it continued whether Clara was awake or asleep. Her sisters reported seeing hands moving in the dark, tracing patterns in the air above her bed, eyes closed, breathing steady and deep. The drawings were coming from somewhere that her waking mind no longer controlled. A second doctor visited this one from a larger town to the north, where they had a hospital and an asylum for people whose minds had broken in ways that families couldn't manage. Hushed tones carried the conversation, words about institutions, treatment, the possibility that Clara might recover if taken away from the home that seemed to feed her condition. Her father refused. His daughter hadn't left the house in months, had done nothing wrong, and he wouldn't send her to a place where strangers would chain her to a wall or bleed her with leeches or subject her to the other horrors that country doctors whispered about when they discussed asylums. The doctor left without pressing the point. Enough cases over the years had taught him that some families would rather carry their burdens alone than surrender them to systems they didn't trust. The Pendletons thought they had time. The storm would pass, the winter would come, and Clara would remain at her table, drawing the same impossible world with the same steady hand. What they didn't know was that the land had already decided to finish what it had started. The evening of her second disappearance began like any other. Mrs. Pendleton prepared supper from the stores they had laid in for the winter. Salt pork, beans, bread that had been baked that morning. Clara sat at the table and ate what was placed before her, her eyes focused on the wood grain, as if it contained a map more urgent than any she had drawn on paper. Her father talked about the farm, about the cows that needed attention, about the fence that had washed out in the last rain. Her sisters chattered about neighborhood gossip, about who was courting whom, about the preacher's sermon last Sunday. The conversation flowed around Clara the way water flows around a stone in a stream, and she gave no sign that she heard any of it. After supper, her mother cleared the plates, and her father went out to check on the livestock. The sisters moved to the front room to work on their sewing by the light of the remaining lamp. Clara stayed at the kitchen table, her hands resting on its surface, her fingers touching the scratches she had made in the wood over the previous weeks. No one thought to watch her. They had grown accustomed to her silences, her stillness, her presence. That occupied space, without demanding attention. She had become part of the furniture of their grief, a constant reminder of what they had lost that didn't require active mourning because she was still physically among them. The storm that night wasn't predicted. The sky had been clear at sunset, but by 9 o'clock the wind had shifted, bringing a wall of cloud down from the western ridges that blotted out the stars in minutes. The rain came hard and cold, driven by gusts that rattled the windows and made the old house groan at its joints. Thunder rolled through the valley with a depth that suggested it was originating from inside the mountains themselves, not from the sky above them. Lightning turned the darkness outside into a series of frozen images, each one lasting just long enough to imprint a tree or a fence post on the eye before the blackness returned. Clara's mother was the first to notice. A trip to the kitchen for a cup of water revealed the back door standing open, rain blowing straight into the room, pooling on the floor and soaking the maps that still hung on the nearest wall. A call went unanswered. Running to the door and looking into the yard brought nothing the lightning could hold on to, just water, wind, and dark shapes of outbuildings that seemed to move when the wind hit them. Her husband's name was called then, her daughter's. And then she ran out into the storm herself, barefoot and in her nightdress, screaming a name that Clara could no longer answer to, even if she had wanted to. Her shoes were found by the edge of the woods, placed side by side, as if she had stepped out of them deliberately before entering the trees. No footprints remained in the mud, because the rain had already erased them. The dogs wouldn't enter the forest, whining and pulling at their leashes, until they lay down in the wet grass, with their tails between their legs, refusing to obey even the commands of the men who had raised them from pups. Searchers spread out with lanterns that the wind kept threatening to extinguish, but the light didn't penetrate far into the timber. The trees were too dense, the rain too heavy, the darkness too complete. Dawn arrived before the searching stopped, the storm having passed, and the valley steaming under a gray morning sky. Voices gave out from calling her name. And then they stopped because everyone understood, without anyone saying it, that Clara Pendleton had gone back to the place that had made her mute, and this time the woods wouldn't be giving her back. The Pendleton family didn't leave the valley. They continued to farm their land, to attend church, to greet their neighbors on the road. But something in the house had been emptied that couldn't be refilled. The maps remained on the walls for months, until the weight of looking at them became too much to bear. Some were burned, some were folded and stored in a chest that was pushed to the back of an upstairs room. A few were taken by visitors who claimed they wanted to study them, though no study ever produced a result that anyone spoke of publicly. The charcoal marks faded over time, but they never disappeared completely. Years later, when the house was sold to another family, the new owners reported finding scraps of paper in the walls and beneath the floorboards, each one covered in the same precise lines, the same impossible passages, the same architecture of a world that refused to be verified. The story of Clara Pendleton became one of those legends that the Shenandoah Valley keeps close to itself, not shared with outsiders, not written down in the history books that tourists carry through the region. It was told at firesides on winter nights, in the low voices that people use when they discuss things that they believe but can't prove. Over time, the details shifted. Some versions said she had been drawing the paths of the dead. Others claimed she had mapped an ancient mining operation dug by settlers who had vanished before the Revolutionary War. A few insisted that the tunnels were real, that they had been found and explored by men who never came back to tell what they had seen, and that Clara had been the only person who ever found her way out. None of these versions contradicted each other in any essential way. They all agreed on the central fact that a young woman had walked into the Shenandoah woods and returned with knowledge that shouldn't have been available to her, and that the land had eventually reclaimed what it had loaned. If you walk the ridges near where the Pendleton farm once stood, you will still find the stone outcropping that Silas Crane recognized. It looks like any other rock formation in a valley full of stone. But local people will tell you, if you ask in the right way, and if they decide you're someone who can be trusted with the answer, that the ground in that area sounds different. Not hollow, exactly. Not empty, but different. As if something beneath your feet is aware that you're walking above it and is waiting for the right person to walk the path that Clara Pendleton walked at the right time, with the right kind of silence in their heart. Clara Pendleton never explained what she saw. She never wrote a word about it, never spoke a single sentence that could be recorded and passed down. What she left behind were maps of a world that may or may not exist, drawn by hands that moved without her conscious will, depicting passages that no one else has ever been able to find. The Shenandoah woods are still there, older than the farms that cleared them, older than the roads that crossed them, older than the stories that try to contain them. And if you find yourself walking those ridges on an autumn afternoon, when the light is failing and the mist is rising from the hollows, remember that some silences aren't empty. Some silences are full of things that have never learned to speak in words. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and share it with someone who understands that the deepest mysteries are the ones the land keeps for itself.